Uh, Today's program is sponsored by the Program on Constitutional Government, and it's part of the Center for American Political Studies, which in turn is part of the Government Department, part of Harvard. That's our ID. So we've got a speaker today, and his name is Charles Murray. I introduced him yesterday at the Kennedy School, so I wouldn't want to bore him with a repeat of the same. But he's written many famous and influential books. None of them is more controversial than The Bell Curve, which came in 1994, written with our dear friend Richard Herrnstein, and greeted with, we can't say neglect, no. But with the kind of applause that brave men sometimes have to endure, but now it's 20 years later, and this book, which I think has yet to make the mark that it will make, is very much as relevant as it was when it came out, and very important, very powerful. And here's our author, Charles Murray, to explain it, defend it. Charles.
Thank you, Harvey. It's nice to be back at Harvard again. Lovely to see Roberta Wilson here and some other friends from the past. Dick and I, but here's my plan. I'm going to start out giving you a quick summary of the book because not all of you have read it, and some of you have read it, but if you're like me, it was far too long ago for you to have a clear idea in your mind of what it said. That won't take very long. Then I would like to take a few of the major topics that were the subject of such controversy and give you my sense of where the science stands on the empirical arguments. And I'm going to intersperse all of this with some war stories because, in fact, I think I look back in the bell curve the way the veterans of D-Day looked on the landing at Omaha Beach. It was a unique time in my life. One of the saddest parts being that Dick Herrnstein was not with me when it happened. He died a matter of days before the first bound volumes appeared. I'll give you, however, one sense of what it was like. About 3 months after the book came out, long after the furor had started, I had given up at this point reading newspapers or watching television. If there was any chance at all, they would mention the bell curve. I was, for some reason, kind of sensitive about what was being said about it. But Catherine, my wife, would read all of these things, and she would tell me if I had to respond. So she would read Stephen Jay Gould's review in the New Yorker, and she'd say, you've got to respond to this, and so forth. But otherwise, I stayed away from all this. She informed me one morning, again, 3 or 4 months after the book came out, that in that morning's Washington Post, there were 2 op-ed pieces and 2 news stories talking about the bell curve as part of their subject. That's the level of intensity. And the degree to which words like pseudoscience and racist and allegations of fudging data and the rest of this, they were just all over. I was clinically depressed at the time, I think. I don't know that for sure, but I sure felt like I was clinically depressed. But I also, for the first time in my life, had discretionary income on the way because the book did sell very well. And the result is I now have in my cellar at home an awful lot of good wines from the early 1990s, which I bought in great quantities at that time. My wife thinking, well, if it makes him feel better, just let him do it. If actually I'd spent all of the discretionary income on those wines as an investment, I'd be a lot better off than I am now. So the bell curve itself, over 900 pages. I don't know how many charts and tables. It was very data intensive. I think there were over 100 pages of footnotes, many of those footnotes being small essays in themselves, several appendixes. And it sold 330,000 copies in hardback, which is a strange combination of things. The book itself, when Dick and I set out on it, and while we were working on it, we wanted to make it a moderate book. We wanted to make it moderate in tone, unhysterical, no headline-catching phrases. We wanted its science to be very moderate. Dick had a saying that he did not like to ask the data to give up more than it gladly would give. And so I would argue that we pulled a lot of punches in that book in terms of what we said and how we said it. The book is divided into four main parts. The first part, and let me just bring this up because I need some reminding myself about how this works. The first part was the emergence of a cognitive elite. If any of you have read Coming Apart, the first couple of chapters are lifted almost verbatim from the bell curve. There are long chunks of text in there which really are close to verbatim. And that's the nice thing of having written a book like The Bell Curve, which got so much commentary but so few people read it, that I could get away with recycling this material. But the emergence of the cognitive elite talked about the same issues that were in Coming Apart, about cognitive partitioning that was going on in the United States, driven by a couple of phenomena. One was that the college sorting machine kicked into high gear during the 1950s, so that, here's my favorite illustration. The Harvard incoming freshman class in 1952 had mean SAT verbals of, I think, about 578. In 1960, the incoming Harvard freshman class had mean SAT verbals in the high 600s. It had gone up over about a standard deviation over the course of 8 years. It was a conscious decision on the part of Harvard. Dean Bender wrote about the notion Harvard was going to be a place for the most talented as opposed to the socially most prominent. But the same thing was going on throughout the university system, all the way down. So cognitive sorting got into high gear then, not the 1960s, the 1950s. And that was one of the forces. You had a lot more intellectual talent being identified, sent off to the best schools. At the same time, something else was going on in the economy, and that is brains were becoming worth a lot more in the marketplace. And we went through the same kind of data that Robert Reich went through in Work of Nations, which came out a few years earlier, the same kind of data that everybody talks about now, which only accelerated after the 1950s, as being smart simply had greater market value for a variety of reasons that most of you in this room already know. You take those two things together, and you have a lot of people who were becoming affluent, who in the old days couldn't become affluent. For example, those people who had very high math ability, but no interpersonal skills, who in 1920 could be actuaries, and by the 1970s, 80s, and 90s could command very large salaries from Silicon Valley, and could command even larger promises of money from the quant hedge funds in New York City and the surrounding suburbs. So we talked about that, and talked in addition to the way that was contributing to a layer cake in America. That's the reason for the subtitle of The Bell Curve, which is Intelligence and Class Structure in American Life. We then turn in part two to cognitive classes and social behavior. And here we wanted to establish the relationship of IQ to a wide variety of socioeconomic outcomes. We had chapters on poverty and on schooling and on unemployment, family structure, welfare dependency, parenting styles, and crime. We also had one on civility and citizenship. This is the place where we did a lot of regression analysis, but we wanted to keep it straightforward. We did not want to toss 12 different independent variables into the mix. We wanted something that a general lay audience could follow. So we had a measure, we had a socioeconomic status index, comprised, as they all are, of income, education, and occupation, a combination thereof. And we had the score on the AFQT, a highly G-loaded test from the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth. And we also did the kind of thing that I am very proud of, but attracted a lot of technical criticism. One of the big problems in trying to assess the relationship of IQ to socioeconomic outcomes is, how do you treat education? Do you just throw education in as one more independent variable when you know there's such an interaction between education and IQ? To us, are there really sophisticated techniques that can disentangle, to some degree, that problem? Yeah, there are, but they are also quite complex. So what Dick and I did was we had sub-analyses that consisted of homogeneous educational samples, a sample of people who had exactly 12 years of education, high school diploma, no more, no less, and another subsample that had exactly 16 years of college, no more, no less. And then we demonstrated that for those groups independently, there was an important independent effect of IQ. Seems to me a very elegant way, actually, to deal with the education problem, and we were criticized by many eminent econometricians and sociologists for being too simple-minded in the way we dealt with it. That was quite irritating to me. Then we moved from that part of the discussion to the national context, because in all of those chapters about socioeconomic outcomes, we'd done one other thing. We had limited the sample to non-Latino whites. Again, which seemed to us to be a really smart thing to do. He said, forget about all the complications of race. Here is the independent effect of IQ on these outcomes for a non-Latino white population. So the next part of the book was to say, can you generalize to the rest of the population? Dick and I, at one point during the writing, considered not discussing race at all. It just was the elephant in the corner. There's no way you could do that whole book and not confront race. And so this part of the book had to assess the question, do IQ scores measure the same thing in blacks and other ethnic racial subgroups as they measure in whites? And there's a very large technical literature on that. The technical literature is quite clear. Yeah, it does measure the same thing. It's not cultural bias that explains the difference in test scores. The predictiveness of the tests is equal for, well, let me rephrase that. The predictive validity of the test is not equal, but insofar as there is a difference, it is that IQ tests tend to overpredict black performance rather than underpredict it. Whereas if the tests were biased against blacks, it would be the other way around. So it was an issue that we had to tackle. So chapter 13, that was an accident of numbering that I wasn't too happy about. Chapter 13 took on ethnic differences on IQ. Dick and I were smart enough to put in the opening paragraphs of that chapter, to those of you who have turned first to this chapter, because we were sure that we knew that race and IQ was going to get a lot of attention. After the storm erupted, I don't know how many times I went back and reread that chapter from beginning to end, asking myself how we could have done it better. And actually, if you, as an exercise, go read that chapter, I'd be interested in your reactions. My sense is we said it right the first time, and it's a very unhysterical chapter. It's a very nuanced chapter, but it didn't work. We talked about the Asian, elevated visual spatial skills, maybe elevated general cognitive ability. There's still some doubt about that. We mentioned in a box. I insisted on this. Dick didn't want to do it. We talked about elevated Ashkenazi IQ. We talked about all of the possible reasons why these differences might be, invalid, starting with test bias and going through the whole list. Then we said, okay, now we're going to talk about genes and IQ and race. We led off with Richard Lewontin's analogy about you can have genetically identical seed corn, and if you plant one handful in Iowa and another handful in Nevada, that you will get very different group results, even though there has been genetic identity between the two. And we presented the literature that said that it's got to be all environmental, and we presented the literature that said there is an admixture of genes in the racial differences. And we ended our discussion by saying, if you are convinced that either side of this argument has won out to the exclusion of the other, we have not done a good enough job of presenting the data. That in our view, in our view, probably both are implicated to some extent as to what the mix might be. We are agnostic. The data do not yet justify an estimate. It was that sentence that was the entire complete basis for saying that the bell curve set out to prove that blacks are genetically inferior to whites.
The final
That-
sentence?
That was,
of the chapter?
no, the quote I just gave you. Those couple of sentences were the entire basis for saying that the book was, purpose of the bell curve was to prove blacks genetically inferior. And then we went on to conclude that chapter by saying, you know, it doesn't really make much difference how much genes are involved, because even if we knew tomorrow that it was entirely environmental, it's not as if we have all these cool ideas for raising black IQ that we aren't trying. And if we were to find out tomorrow that it's all genetic, what difference is that going to make when you run into a black youngster with an IQ of 130? He still has he has an IQ of 130. And to treat him differently because of his race is crazy. Didn't do any good. The next part was a set of relating the differences, the relationship of IQ to socioeconomic outcomes, to a variety of policy issues, affirmative action, attempts to raise IQ, things like that. And then we had a couple of final chapters that discussed Dick's and my view of what it all meant in terms of the future of America, which I won't try to summarize here. So that was a bell curve. Comes out, creates a firestorm. There was a whole cottage industry of books. I mean, you could have a shelf of books that were written about the bell curve in the months thereafter. Where do we stand on some of the things that raised all the controversy? Well, I'll take a few of the major topics. The first is the reality of G, the general mental factor. Stephen Jay Gould is the most famous among the people who said in the Mismeasure of Man that it's a statistical artifact, that factor analysis can produce a general factor, or factor analysis can produce a variety of different factors, and your choice of analytic method radically affects the results. And so basically, the psychometricians have just made up this thing called G that has no physiological reality. Mismeasure of Man has been accepted for a long time in among non-specialists in academia, and to some degree in the general public, as the categorical refutation of G. Within the scientific community, when the book first came out, among specialists, it was jeered. I mean, there was the review in Nature said that Stephen Jay Gould's analysis of psychometrics stops where the field was 25 years ago, and that was written in 1981 when Mismeasure of Man came out. I mean, the variety of ways in which even at the time Gould's argument had no scientific standing among specialists is hard to exaggerate. Then in 1994, when he writes the review for the New Yorker, having been aware, he has to have been aware of the just brutal treatment his argument had gotten, he repeated the argument without indicating that it required any amendment, and there was a new issue of Mismeasure of Man with a new introduction by Steve Gould, which did not mention any of the difficulties with his argument. But this is a case where the decoding of the genome has, and the advances in the studies of neuroimaging and all the other things that have happened with neuroscience have opened up a whole lot of knowledge we didn't have before. And essentially, no, I won't bother with any details. I'm probably not the right person to give them to you anyway. But is the structure of the brain, certain regions of white matter, certain regions of gray matter. The way they're studying these is by finding the correlations that they have with IQ test scores. And guess what? The element in IQ test scores that produce the highest correlations, and they are quite stunningly high correlations in some cases, is the subset of the IQ score, which is G. There are also, at this point, we know now to a fairly well that G is a summary statement of a real property of the brain that's very important. The next great topic, of course, was race. I will say there's been no change in the technical literature about the issues we discussed in the bell curve. Namely saying that IQ scores for blacks mean pretty much the same thing that IQ scores mean for whites and for Asians and the rest. The tests are pretty good. The best tests are quite good as measures of IQ. There really hasn't been, as far as I know, much advance in that aspect of the knowledge at all. We were right then. We were right now. By the way, I should add that the APA subsequently had a task force on IQ a couple of years later. This was triggered by the bell curve. And they put out a statement, a joint statement of what we know about IQ. And there basically was no daylight between that report and what Dick and I said about race and IQ, with one exception. They said when it comes to the genetic origins of the racial differences, that there is no direct evidence whatsoever to suggest that genes are involved. Well, I mean, that's right. We didn't say there was in the bell curve. There was a whole lot of indirect evidence that suggested that some implication of genetics was the parsimonious way to understand characteristics of differences in the profiles of scores between blacks and whites. That was the only thing that the APA sort of put a little bit of distance between us and on.
Excuse me, APA is a psychologist?
American Psychological Association, sorry. Well, this is another area in which the decoding of the genome has produced a lot of information we did not have in 1994. And I guess I'm going to go through it briefly for you because it's of interest, and it is also something that has not yet percolated into the non-scientific world, but it's about to. As in the first week of May, a book is going to be published by Nicholas Wade. Many of you are already familiar with him. He's been a science writer at the New York Times for 20-odd years. He's the author of Before the Dawn, which is a book on evolutionary biology, and a book called The Faith Instinct, which was about the evolutionary origins of religion. And apparently Nicholas Wade, who is now 72 and retired from the Times, has decided, what the hell? And he is writing a book called A Troublesome Inheritance, Genes, Race, and History. And it's a beautifully done book. I've gotten the galleys and I've read it. It could serve as a textbook for a college course, with one chapter for each of the salient subjects. It's really terrific. But I will simply, and he does not directly deal much with IQ, a little bit. The main point is this. The arguments about, is race a social construct? Well, let me back off and make a more embracing statement. You have seen over the last decade, since the genome was decoded in 2003, I guess, this increasing split between the received wisdom in academia among non-specialists and the technical literature in genetics and neuroscience. So they are now in just two different worlds. So that, for example, race is a social construct. We don't know how to divide people into races. Lewontin's famous statement that We now know that race is of no taxonomic significance because racial variance accounts for only 6% or something like that of the total variance. Things that are just almost recited as mantras among the non-specialists. And then Stephen Jay Gould's very famous statement that evolution stopped so long ago before the Homo sapiens left Africa. There's simply, as a fact of history, no possibility of important racial differences. We now know all of those to be absolutely false. Not in the opinion of some geneticists versus the opinion of other geneticists, but everybody who studies these issues. What we know now is, first, that whereas Lewontin was correct about the percentage of difference, that has nothing to do with the importance of that small percentage of genes that are different across races, so that they can easily account for major differences among the races. That's one thing that was wrong. There was also another aspect of it called Lewontin's fallacy I won't get into. But the really big news that very few people anticipated is that we now know that evolution has not only continued past the time that Homo sapiens left Africa, it's continuing right now. And that there are a variety of major genetic changes that have occurred in populations within historic times, not even in prehistory. We know that we can now identify, I'm using the word we loosely, I'm not one of the people who's involved in this field, but we know genes that are under pressure for selection. Because using techniques that are way beyond me, you can tell at what point in history, certain kinds of alleles emerge, certain kinds of variations emerge. You can time those, and you can also tell with right now what's going on. Well, so first you've had a lot of evolution. There is one argument that says that elevated Jewish IQ occurred between 800 in the Common Era and 1600 in the Common Era. It's still being argued, but it's not an implausible argument, and it's a serious argument made with a lot of data. But we know that lactose tolerance evolved within a fairly narrow period of time after the advent of agriculture. There are lots of others. We also know when we look at the genes under selection pressure that they bear no similarity across races. That the genes that European whites are under selection pressure are different from those that characterized East Asians, are different from those that characterize Africans in Africa. All of this leads to a lot of reasons to believe that when you have human populations that have been separated, as long as the basic races have been separated, you're going to get lots of differences. And there is collateral evidence for a lot of, insofar as we are learning specific roles of specific genes, this story is getting more and more problematic in the following sense. We don't know a whole lot of specific functions of genes. Maybe I did a search of the literature, but I'm not a specialist. I'm sure I missed some. But we have a dozen or so genes that we know what kinds of outcomes they're implicated in, and we also know what the racial variation is in the occurrence of these genes. So all but one of them show substantial racial differences along the lines that the phenotype would predict. It's as if you have a great big jar of 100,000 marbles, and you have no idea, you've got white marbles and purple marbles, and you have no idea what the proportions are a priori. You reach in and you grab out a dozen of them, and 10 out of the 12 are purple. The assumption ought to be you're going to find a whole lot more purple marbles in that jar, and that's kind of where we are with that. So with regard to the great controversy about the bell curve, which was an illegitimate controversy insofar as Dick and I did not make a big deal out of genes, but that was the flashpoint. we are entering an era in which it's analogous to the Copernican revolution, where everybody's a Ptolemaist, and then there comes a point at which it becomes scientifically unacceptable to be a Ptolemaist anymore. And at that time, with that historical incident, everybody became Copernicans. The same thing happened with Newtonian physics instead of Aristotelian physics. What's going to happen when one of the central tenets of the way of thinking about a variety of issues in the government and sociology and economics and anthropological departments of Harvard, when some of the major tenets of that are shown to be scientifically wrong? What's going to happen when E.O. Wilson is vindicated and there is a situation in which there is going to be an integration of the social sciences and biology? That's one of the most interesting things that's going on in the contemporary world. This book is coming out in May. It's going to be really hard to ignore a major book written by somebody with Nicholas Wade's credentials, and I'm awaiting that event with great interest. The third, and I'm going to stop in about 5 minutes, Harvey, if you're wondering, but this will close it out. The third major source of the controversy about the bell curve was the plasticity of IQ. And that persists today in the calls for universal pre-K. James Heckman has moved from his fields of specialization in economics to analysis of the effects of pre-K programs, and is now one of the leading spokesmen for the efficacy of such programs. And in other ways, we still live in a world in which the solution for a wide variety of our problems is education. This sometimes takes the form of what I would call educational romanticism, the notion that if only we provide the right educational opportunities to kids, that they can all become nuclear physicists. People don't really say it in those explicit terms, but just notice the unwillingness of anyone who talks about education to step back and say, oh, by the way, a lot of kids aren't smart enough to do X, Y, or Z. They will not say that. Here's the problem. In terms of the plasticity of IQ, all the evidence says that what you get at about age 6 is what you're stuck with for the rest of your life, more or less. I mean, there are obviously individual exceptions, but by that I mean if you take 1,000 children at age 6, test them their IQ, test them again at 18, you will find very high correlation between those two sets of scores. It will not be 1. It'll be less than 1. There are exceptions. You can usually identify the reasons for those exceptions. You know, there's been a disease or some other traumatic event. But anyway, the overall correlation is very high. And furthermore, and this is a finding that goes all the way back to the Coleman report, the kinds of schools the kids went to will not explain the exceptions. You are not going to get better results from the kids who went to better schools. Those of you who are paying $35,000 a year for private schools might want to consider that as part of your calculations. Well, as that has become more widely accepted, I think, than the argument you can't do anything at all, even younger. Because a set of the findings that have come out in the last 15, 20 years has been the brain is much more plastic at very young ages. There's a lot of brain development that goes on, and it is entirely plausible that intensive interventions at that age could make a permanent difference because of that. In some sense, it is surprising that the results are so meager. Essentially, we are in a situation where the advocates for preschool as being a really potentially important intervention are peri-preschool and abecedarian. Peri-preschool was in the early 1960s, with about 50 in the experimental group. Abecedarian was in the late 1960s, early 1970s. It had a few more, 60 or 70 maybe, in the experimental group. These were done at a time when quasi-experimental quantitative techniques of evaluation were really primitive, and these were evaluations that were conducted by the same people who mounted the program. If we were talking about any other intervention except trying to help very young children do better in life, the idea of using 50-year-old studies of that quality and size as the basis for action would be nonsensical. The thing is, though, we don't have to go back and agonize over all the methodological problems and the problems of implementation of the program that attend those experiments, because we now have much larger scale, much better methodological evaluations. We replicated, the government replicated, the Abecedarian approach, which is very intensive. They did it for a sample that was, as I recall, the experimental sample was about 900, several hundred. It was done at a variety of sites. The evaluation was conducted independently of the people who were running the program. It was a very sophisticated evaluation with very carefully chosen experimental and control groups. It ran for 18 years, and it had exactly the typical pattern that Dick and I described for the literature when we did the bell curve, which is to say, the follow-up at 3 years old was really terrific. You saw major cognitive improvements in the kids, given all the limitations of measuring cognitive capacity at 3, but still they were very encouraging results. Then you measure them at age 5. Those results had attenuated a lot. Then you have the results at age 18, and the results are zilch. So there are other studies similar to that. What I'm saying is that the pessimism that Dick and I had in our assessment of our ability to change cognitive functioning in 1994 has unfortunately been vindicated. And that's not good news. Well, I've talked to somewhat longer than I intended. That still gives us an hour for discussion. I will stop here.
So, maybe there's a question. Yes.
Hi, my name is Peter, and
We talked
I'm
last time.
in the physics department. This is very sort of funny that I get to actually introduce some of my background. So I mentioned to you yesterday, as I was in Stephen Jay Gould's last class, and the class actually was on analytical paleontology. So this was during my PhD, and I think the big context of this is that I think the academic, politically correct mafia, which you are, I consider one of the great fighters, I think may actually be the cause of a lot of these outcomes. So I mean, he, for instance, did not have a very good reputation, particularly on technical matters within the field, but he was sort of the Barack Obama of paleontology, right? Didn't really do a whole lot, but nobody can criticize him, right? Because he's sort of leading the culture wars against the religionists. And so, I mean, I think it sort of fits very well into that. But more to the point, what you were saying, I think modern science, and I'm not an expert on this, but for instance, the twin studies, right, that show that you can take two identical twins, separate them, and have widely differing backgrounds, and when you assess them 20 years later, they have identical outcomes. I mean, to me, that's basically sort of a smoking gun of all the things that you're saying. And I think, to talk about even beyond genetics, this whole idea of epigenetics, it's not just your genes, but how they're expressed. I mean, I think that there is this mafia that, kicked Larry Summers out or whatnot. You can't question these sort of religious beliefs ultimately on the social science side, even though they're decades out of date. You would never hear a proper, geneticist or somebody studying epigenetics that there can't possibly, I mean, you know that it's obvious there have to be all kinds of correlations. What they mean and what we as a society do about them have, those are separate questions, but it's sort of beyond laughable, I mean, to your point, that anybody would maintain that there are no significant differences between these populations, either in genetics or even beyond in epigenetics.
That's not a question, I guess.
Yeah, so, I mean, is there a possibility that is there any possibility that somebody's going to actually sort of make this point that, is there some way that like a set of professional scientists that really know this stuff could update the bell curve and essentially reach the same conclusions? I mean,
Yeah, look, here's the problem. Bruce Lahn still is a brilliant young geneticist, and he started to do work on the genetics of brain size. And there are well-established differences in brain size among populations. And brain size is correlated about 0.4, 0.5 with IQ scores. And the reaction he got to that led him to publicly declare he would no longer do work in this field. There is nobody out there who wants to bell the cat. That's why I actually have enormous admiration for Nicholas Wade, because even though he is not a scientist himself, he has a very secure reputation, and one which makes him welcome at dinner parties in the Upper East Side of New York and otherwise be socially acceptable. And he is, I think, going to be throwing all of that away and enduring a lot of grief for writing the book. You know, there's another funny thing going on. I would be interested to see how this plays out. Remember what I just said about a dozen genes where you know what the differences are in the racial occurrence of them, or alleles, I should say. How do I know that? I don't know that because there are published technical studies which say here are the racial differences in these. It's because in studies that are trying to pin down the genes that affect educational outcomes, ability to read, other kinds of things, aggressive behavior, well, they're coming up with specific sites. And in technical articles of those sort, they give the identification of the SNP, of the single nucleotide polymorphism. That is the source of it, all right? So there's the number. You go on to the HapMap website, you plug in that number, and say, give me the occurrence of this by race. And it does it. Well, if I can do that, anybody else can do it. And so you're going to continue to have articles which are trying to pin down the relationship of specific genes to specific kinds of behaviors. Those will typically be for populations that are of the same race. And there's a good methodological reason for doing that. But that still would let you go and say, oh, well, how do those fit across races? And those are going to be not just 1 dozen, but they're going to be 2 dozen, they're going to be 3 dozen, 4 dozen, and this is all going to happen within a matter of a few years, maybe hundreds accumulating. I have one theory which probably won't work, but it says what's going to happen is, as this goes on, people who are doing the same thing I'm doing will just take for granted that pretty much every time you plug these specific sites into the HapMap, you're almost always going to have an important genetic difference, racial difference.
Immunology, public health, medicine,
Yeah,
right?
I know.
I mean, it's all built. All these differences are obviously built in, right? And yet
Yeah.
people
So
potentially.
it'll just be taken for granted after a while by people who do the work, and none of them are going to want to say it publicly. And it'll be sort of, and maybe it'll start to seep into the social sciences as well, whereby people just won't talk about it as much anymore. I don't know, it seems unlikely. That's unlikely.
Professor Rosen and Professor Mankiw.
I'm a professor in the government department. I may be Harvey's only Republican colleague in the government department. I wrote a
Come to the
book.
economics department once in a while.
Yes.
A few more.
I'll visit you in internal exile. I wrote a book explaining the relationship of biological variations on human behavior associated with war, in particular violent behavior. I'm saying this because what you have done is important. What you have said today is true insofar as we're able to ascertain the truth at any given moment in time. But I do want to raise a question. You did not mention epigenetics, and Peter's question did raise it. And as our understanding has improved, we understand now, as you well know, that our DNA is much less a blueprint or a recipe and much more like a computer code which can be switched on or off in part or in whole as a result of various external environmental or other cues. And that is, it's very interesting. Not much of the epigenetic revolution has yet seemed to be relevant to the issue of cognitive ability, and you're quite correct in stating the absence of evidence there. But there are other issues where it has been demonstrated to be relevant to social policy. And it's going to create all kinds of very difficult conundrums, because I've raised this in government department seminars and I've gotten beaten up. In particular, again, as you know, there are some alleles that are correlated with propensity to violent behavior. The monoamine oxide, the MAOA gene, which is now understood to be subject to epigenetic environmental cues. And in a very interesting way, and this was first found out by sociologists and anthropologists, later replicate, that if you take young adolescent males and subject them to extreme trauma, they're much more likely to display violent behavior afterwards than if the same people with the same genetic profiles. So there's some indirect evidence that stress hormones serve as a way of switching on a part of your genetic inheritance, which may be functional in terms of dealing with very stressful environments.
Mm-hmm.
The obvious policy implication of this, which was raised not by me, but by an American Special Forces officer who had been deployed in violent. So maybe what we should be doing is taking young adolescent males out of the settings in which they are more likely to be exposed to trauma if we want to break the cycle of violence. I simply noted this as an observation in a seminar on our theories of violent behavior, and got the response was, "I am very angry." Okay, I am very angry that people would even mention the issue of taking cohorts of young males out of an environment in ways which you think might be good for them. So the science is proceeding, it is generating, but the idea that we'll sort of then all be on the same page about what to do about it, I think is a misreading of human nature. And in particular, some of the implications based on good and improving science may be very discomforting. And because you have focused so much of your professional life on this issue, I was wondering what your thoughts are about this epigenetic revolution, the ways in which people may think about the ways in which you may wish to combine an understanding of our DNA with an understanding of the way in which it's activated or deactivated as it might be applied to social policy.
Well, two quick responses. One, the specific example you gave of the MOA, what's?
Monoamine oxide.
Yeah. This, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, there is a specific, it's the number of repeats, right, in a particular set of alleles, which has been associated with propensity to, it's called the warrior gene in some cases. And you also stated exactly right that you know, it can be turned on and off. I mean, the implications, as you stated, are all correct, and then you add on to that the racial overlay. Because the incidence of that in the African American population is, I think, about 3%. Does that sound right to you?
I won't swear to the number,
3 to 5.
but I will add what Professor Kagan in the psychology department has published. He buried deep in his book on child psychology that testosterone receptors vary in their number across racial groups. And people's responses to levels of testosterone is moderated by the number of testosterone receptors they have. And African Americans have the highest numbers of testosterone receptors, Caucasian Americans have the second, and Asian Americans have the lowest numbers, which again correlates, it is genetically explained, and has an effect on violent behavior.
In any case, you've got a presence in the black population that's about 30 times what it is in the whites, and we don't have real good data on Asians, but among whites it's a multiple of the times it's found among East Asians. So you first have a social policy implication which they're angry about because of doing this to people, but then you got the racial overlay on that, which makes it a whole lot worse.
Yes.
And that's going to happen with a whole bunch of different things. Now, my attitude toward the epigenetics is, I'm not a specialist. The analogy that comes to mind with me is the interaction of genes and environment in advantaged families versus disadvantaged families. whereby, yes, you have only 40%, 50%, 60%, who knows? Let's say it's 50% of IQ is determined by genes, 50% by environment. And then we find out first a lot of the environmental effect is the non-shared environment, which is not things like the quality of the schools you go to, but some of it is. And among the things in the shared environment that is useful is parental parenting practices. And so what's the interaction effect?
Sure.
The interaction effect is the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. Because it's the parents who already have these assets that are reading to their kids all the time and talking all the time. And insofar as you have environmental causes for triggering certain kind of things, it seems likely to me that there's going to be an interaction there which increases rather than decreases inequality. That leaves open the option of outside interventions so that you read more to kids even though they don't have parents to read to them, and you expose them to pre-K education. But then again, we get back to how difficult it is to achieve desired effects even though we know it should be theoretically possible.
I have two questions. The first was to what extent you think interventions could affect non-cognitive skills. We've talked to people like Heckman or my colleague Raj Chetty, and who believes that the early interventions matter. That they often emphasize is not its impact on G, which is what the bell curve was all about, but its impact on non-cognitive things like your ability to sit still, your self-control, perseverance, and so on. And as an economist, I'm tempted to think that G is only an intermediate good. What we really care about is income. And if we can give people other skills, give other skills that produce them income, even if they don't have G, they'll be pretty happy.
Yeah.
So that was my first question, whether there's any hope of the non-cognitive skills. My second question was about another book, The Nurture Assumption by Judith Harris, that came out, which had a similar kind of reaction in some circles. And I was wondering whether you felt some comedy with her, and whether you read the book, whether you thought it was similar in some of its themes.
With regard to these non-cognitive outcomes, I guess that I just say, well, let's look at the data. And if they have some data besides Abecedarian and Perry Preschool, that's fine. And if it's not, again, implausible to me that you could have behavioral outcomes like that and not have cognitive outcomes. That could happen. I'm not aware of powerful evidence that it has. With regard to the nurture assumption, this is a book that basically said parents don't make any difference after all. And this goes to the shared, non-shared environment issue I talked about a minute ago. The non-shared environment could be things such as accidents in the womb. You know, if you're exposed to higher testosterone levels in the womb than your sibling, you're going to have a lot of different characteristics and similar other kinds of prenatal events. Non-shared environment could also be accidents after you're born, but they could also be things like peer groups. We don't really understand the non-shared environment very much. All we do understand is it accounts for most of the variance that environment has. Not the things like quality of schools or parenting styles that you would think. Well, for that matter, parenting styles can be different from two different siblings. You know, parents change in the way they treat their kids. So you've got the non-shared environment, which dominates. The nurture assumption, I think peer groups are one of the major things that she thinks that explains a lot of the environmental. It's one of these cases where, as a father of four, I really resist her argument. I like to think I made a difference in my children's lives. And you know what? I'm like your colleague with regard to non-cognitive things. I don't think we've raised the IQ of our children, but I like to think we've made them nicer. You know, I sort of have this deep-rooted sense of they're nicer because they were raised by my wife and me. I don't have one shred of data to contradict anything she said in the book. As far as I know, there's no body of data out there which have come out since then which say she's wrong. I still think that parents are important. In fact, look, we do know, and I think the difference in behavioral outcomes among children from single-parent homes provide a good first-order case for saying that some things make a difference. And in the case of, for example, not having a male in the home we can zero in on ways that sound very much like this is causal. Things such as I talked about last night briefly, the role of the father as serving as the first boyfriend for a girl 11, 12 years old, which can buffer her against those things. The role of the father as a role model for this is how adult males are supposed to behave. That lacking such a model, you have all sorts of breakdowns in male socialization. So those kinds of things I still think offer avenues for claiming that some things about the family make a difference. But that volume she wrote had a lot of good.
Harris would say that could be genetic, right? Because the people who are likely to leave the mother of their children have a particular personality traits, which could be passed on genetically, which could in turn lead to bad outcomes for their children.
Yep, all of that is true. All of that is true. I'm just trying to have a reed to cling on to, saying here's how the science could work out, where maybe there's a role after all. By the way, these are the kinds of things that will be disentangled, and I don't know whether it's going to be 10 years or 20 or 30, but we will disentangle all this stuff.
It seems there's insufficient scientific study of resistance to science. I mean, that's a serious remark. Is it possible for science to study why people don't accept science?
Particularly people in sociology departments. I do not have any comment.
Yep.
Andy, still though, to try to force you to speculate on this, suppose I could anyway try to distinguish between localized political correctness, such as that emanating from the Upper East Side or the Harvard Faculty Club, and what I might call a more general political correctness, that is a general democratic outlook of citizens who live in a democracy. I wonder if, since you've spent so much time both writing on and being attacked for issues relating to what you'd call natural inequality, if you think that there are, especially since you speak of this new revolution that's about to come upon us, if you think there are important scientific truths that will become undeniable, which will pose a kind of threat, or at least a challenge, to general democratic and egalitarian ethical outlooks. I know that there was a book that came out in the 50s called The Revolt of the Rebellion of the Meritocracy, which spoke of a hyper-efficient meritocratic society in the future England.
The rise of America.
Rise of meritocracy.
The rise of meritocracy, but in the end they revolt, I guess. I gave a spoiler alert, they revolt in the end. So, and this sketches out some of the potential implications of extremely efficient, scientifically backed ideas about meritocratic stratification. And it all points towards a general challenge for a democratic society. I wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
Well, this is the case of one of those questions which I do have thoughts about, but I haven't been asked before in this way, so I do have to think a little bit. And I'm probably not going to say it very well, but it used to be taken for granted that people were different in their abilities, and that this had consequences for how high they were going to rise in the world. Equality as we understand it now simply was not even a concept at the time of the founding and into the 19th century. In other words, American democracy both started and continued for the first couple of hundred years under the assumption, sure, people are different. And some people are smarter than others, some people are more hardworking than others. All of these inequalities exist, and it was not perceived as a threat in and of itself. Now, it did impinge on debates about who should get the vote, and should you have property qualifications for voting, which had to do with people's ability to make good decisions as citizens. And you want to delegate responsibility to the state legislature for selecting senators because you don't want to have too much mass democracy. There were all of those kinds of considerations. There were lots of worries about democracy for precisely that reason. And a lot of the limits in democracy at the outset were predicated on them. But one of the bold aspects of the American experience was that you could reside ultimate power in the people and have a working government. the notion of equality as we have thought of it since, when should we date it? Late 1960s? This is going to be speculative. I think a great deal of what we now call political correctness and all of the things that make equality such a necessary belief, equality, literal kinds of equality, except for the race, class, gender oppression, that I think arose contemporaneously with the Civil Rights Movement, the triumph of the Civil Rights Movement, and is intimately involved in it. And as again, remembering that I'm speculating, as someone who is old enough to remember what it felt like in the early 1960s, there was a real sea change in the consciousness of white America about what it had done to black Americans for 3 or 4 centuries. And you talk about guilt. Yeah, there was a guilt, and it was quite well warranted. And along with that guilt, which was a very visceral kind of feeling among a lot of, it was a sea change in attitudes toward race, also came with it, and I think in a psychologically understandable way, a real unwillingness to concede that there could be any differences that couldn't be explained by the past oppression. And as you had that spread, then you had the women's movement, and that added another impetus for making discussion of inequalities a taboo. And then it continued to spread. And so I wrote an article called The Inequality Taboo, and I mean it literally. That this is a new phenomenon whereby people say, no, if only we lived in a just world, you'd have equal outcomes across all different kinds of groups. That's very new. And I don't think it's intrinsic to the functioning of a democracy. I think it has implications for the functioning of a democracy, but there should be no inherent problem. Here's what scares me. I'm not a psychologist, but what I read about cognitive dissonance leads me to believe that as cognitive dissonance increases, that when it is resolved, you tend to get a fervor of the converted effect. Add to that the natural inborn tendency of academics to believe deep in their hearts that they're smarter than everybody else. What happens when you have, within academia, I'm thinking specifically of this population, when you have a long-held set of constellation of beliefs that have been at the center of your understanding of how the world ought to work, but which increasingly have become hard to hold on to as the science becomes more and more well known. What happens when you finally say to yourself, I guess I was wrong about this? And I'm worried about an overreaction the other way. I'm worried about an overreaction that says, well, you know, the fact is that we have all these huge inequalities, and they ought to govern the way we think about how the world ought to work now. That we aren't going to go back to a system of saying all people are equal in human dignity, but they're different in their specific profile of abilities. We're going to go to a world in which we say that those of us who are really smart enough should be telling other people how they ought to live because we know better than they do. Mr. Bloomberg being one of the first advocates of that point of view. So I'm nervous. I'm nervous for some of the reasons that you raised in your question.
I'm looking for some young person, yes.
I'll be that young person. Thank you so much for speaking. I only have a rudimentary understanding of genetics, but I was very interested specifically in what traits I have a standard chance to pass on if I have children. And so I actually got my genes sequenced with a private thing called 23andMe. It's a private company. It's a very interesting company, and in order to see your traits once you give them, it's just a vial of saliva, you have to go through a lot of, I promise not to sue you, and I understand the predictability of these. And I was very interested, but in order to get access to the rest of my genetic profile, I had to get my father to do it as well. But by the time, this was about early this year, I asked him to do so, the FDA had taken the product off the market. It was kind of a high-profile case because a lot of people had threatened to sue 23andMe because they were given genetic information that they didn't understand, and they changed their lifestyle over. That they were told they had this % chance of this trait expressing Alzheimer's, for example, when they're older, had taken that to be a sort of death warrant and changed their lifestyle and therefore sued the company. So all of this really is to say that there is a very tangible effect of public misperceptions of genetics, and that leads to two questions really, which are, in your experience, what are the most dangerous and pervasive public misperceptions about genetics, and how might these manifest themselves?
I don't think it's so much a misunderstanding of genetics as it is a misunderstanding of probabilities. Because I think it's the same kind of problem that Dick and I ran into in talking about the role of IQ in life, that people want to go in a binary thing and say, well, IQ isn't, look at all these other qualities that go into making a successful person, as though you can't say that IQ is important and also agree with that statement. And so even if you put in a book that IQ is only one of many qualities, and even though we can predict a lot if we have a sample of 10,000, we can't predict much about the individual person just by knowing the IQ score. No matter how often you say that, people have a very hard time translating % probability of something into an understanding of living their lives. And I think that's what's going on with the people who changed their lifestyle, because I have a feeling that this company did not, you just said, they said you have X% of getting Alzheimer's, okay? Technically accurate statement. And obviously people just were unable to process that. I'll say parenthetically, I think that's something that universities ought to think about, that I don't think you should be allowed to get a bachelor's degree in any major without having, as part of a core curriculum, serious study of probability and statistics. Because so many things in life, your opinions on global warming, your opinions on just about anything, need to have a background of understanding the probability, and we don't. So that's what it's not a genetics issue, I think.
Yes.
So I'm highly sympathetic, I think, to many of the things in your books, and but I'm curious 3 ways in which the science of genetics, where it's moving, can kind of complicate the picture down the line, and I'll just sketch these very briefly. The first is, so in the Human Genome Project, when it's mapped, the hope is you can find highly heritable diseases, map those to single phenotype or single genotypes. So things like cystic fibrosis and stuff, that's pretty direct correlation. There's been a lot of gene therapies now targeted at that. So this is one whole area that looks at genetic therapies as a way to actually change genetic code, or that might actually be useful. So say we identify something that's tremendously pathological in the population, there might be ways to intervene in that. So that'd be one way in which perhaps genes aren't as much of destiny. The troubling reality of the last 10 years of the Human Genome Project has been, however, how little progress was made in the medical genetics side of things. So we have highly heritable diseases like schizophrenia, Huntington's, that don't have any clear genetic single gene SNP correlate. And increasingly, people are not even looking at SNPs anymore, genome-wide association studies. And the kind of genetic lesson from that is the degrees of interaction and complexity are enormous. So much so that it's hard to when you think about even mating patterns and how much those upset correlations, the degrees of complexity are here, and things like, say, assortative mating of high IQ people, that could account for autism, or environment can account for autism. It's very hard to distinguish that. So on the complexity side, it may be harder to get some of the tractability we'd like to understand what are the genetic roots of these things. But the final thing is really, just coming back to this epigenetics question, my understanding of the most recent stuff, like the Goody mice study, and as well as some animal model studies in monkeys, is that you can have in prenatal development as well as early childhood development in the first few years, literally identical genetic, identical twins, as well as identical nutrition environment. But because of maternal care, you have these methylation structures changing the transcription, region on genes, and totally different alleles being expressed at totally different rates, which really says early childhood stuff can totally, no, it's not just an environmental actions, like it can totally express, change the genes are being expressed. Are you hopeful that, I mean, suppose we accept all the background picture you put on the table, that the progress of genetic science might actually overcome the sort of inequality, judgment or the inequality stuff we're left with, that either science can intervene in this, or it gives us more and more techniques to either therapeutically, pharmacologically, or environmentally, achieve more equal outcomes? Or do you think we're kind of stuck at a place where this is,
We need to get back to IQ somehow, but I guess you were doing that right at the end of your remarks.
That's okay. I find this all fascinating, so I'm happy to, but as long as you all understand that I'm not a specialist in this, and I'm looking at it as a very interested outsider, I take as an article of faith that we will have very powerful gene therapy interventions available at some point. And the complexity that you talk about is certainly there. I look upon where we are right now at the very bottom of a very steep, nonlinear growth curve in knowledge. And so maybe it'll take 30 years, maybe it'll only take 10. We will, in fact, be able to intervene and do things like affect cognitive repertoires and behavioral repertoires as well. That kind of scares me in a variety of ways, because insofar as that happens, and insofar as governments get involved in it, the prevailing ideology today would say that if you're able to do it, you ought to make little boys no more aggressive than little girls. And I'm not sure that'd be a wise thing to do. But I think we're going to be able to do it. And there will be an upside to that in terms of dealing with deficits.
Okay.
And the other comment is that we already know, even before we knew about the ways in which the expression of genes is greatly affected by parenting style, we know from adoption at birth that you do have an effect on a whole bunch of things from adoption at birth, including IQ. With, I think, the meta-analyses talk in terms of probably about a 7-point boost for a child born into a much better parenting style than he would have had otherwise. And that's not a trivial effect. But notice what I said, adoption at birth. Didn't say pre-K intervention. We have had, I think probably the more we know about how the early environment affects important outcomes, the more clear it will be it has to be a massive intervention, with adoption at birth being the most massive intervention you can have. And that's going to go back to Professor Rosen's earlier statements. All this new knowledge is going to raise huge public policy problems, thinking about what you ought to do.
Would it be a good thing for mankind or humanity if IQs were equalized? Or does inequality in IQ serve a turn?
Well, as opposed to, yeah, yeah. Here is, there is good reason to think that a society that has a small advantage in IQ in terms of narrower variance, or I should say less representation at the low end, has advantages going for it, and in some important ways. That is to say that there are some good things, like living together in a more civilized way and being more prone to cooperation, and a variety of other things do have, impulse control has a correlation with IQ, in part because your time horizon is greater the higher IQ in terms of calculating outcomes. So if we had a population that had a mean IQ 5 points higher than one we have now, it would probably be a more civilized, less violent, and in many ways more attractive society.
What's the correlation between deviousness and IQ?
It might be.
Because
it might be direct.
IQ might lower your impulses by making you more cunning.
Professor Mansfield, I do not know the correlation between IQ and deviousness. I do not.
There's more for science to do.
There's more for science to do.
Yes.
My name is Rekha. I think part of the response to your book by one of the politically correct was to admit that there are racial genetic differences and to celebrate those differences and talk about how the different races should be included, for example, in college admissions for the sake of celebrating diversity. And an example that comes to mind is for University of California, Berkeley. One of the plus factors for admission for a while was coming from a broken home or a dysfunctional family. What about that aspect of it? I mean, even if the left were to accept all the evidence about genetic differences amongst races, would that necessarily, bring them around to the same policy conclusion?
Oh, no. And you know what? It shouldn't. One of the things that Dick and I say in the book, quite explicitly, is that you can have reached this point, and this is for the last couple of chapters, you can have reached this point in the book, and the data we have presented can easily be a rationalization for a Rawlsian egalitarian state. That if IQ is an important determinant of outcomes in life, and if no one deserves his or her IQ, which is patently true, then it is wrong for people to be penalized just because they got the short end of the stick in the lottery. And it's a perfectly plausible reason to become a more enthusiastic social democrat rather than less. And that goes back to what scares me, that as a lot of these things are accepted, I think it will provide a rationale for a paternalistic kind of government that is very scary. Here is what this is not directly responsive to your question, but I want to get it on the table. One of the hardest things to get across to really smart people is that having a lower IQ is not the end of the world. And the way that I thought I had a wonderful thought experiment for doing it, and I will now try it on this room. I won't ask for a show of hands, but play along with me. Okay, first I want you to think of a person who you're sure has an IQ that you consider pretty low, a couple of standard deviations below yours, given the people in this room. I think I have to go that far. Okay, try to think of such a specific person like that that's been in your life. And the question I have is, do you feel sorry for that person? And after you've processed that, I now want you to think of a person that you know damn well is cognitively smarter than you are, substantially smarter than you are, one who can do things intellectually that you know you can't do. And even with you guys, there's such a reference group around here. I'm sure most of us can think of somebody who's really a lot smarter than you are. Do you feel inferior to that person in any meaningful sense? Okay, that's the thought experiment. And here's what I assumed it would do for people. That most people would say, well, actually, I do feel kind of sorry for the person who has 20 points lower IQ than I have. But I don't really feel inferior to the person who has 20 points higher than I have. He's smarter than I am, and can do certain things I can't do intellectually, but that doesn't make me inferior. That's what I thought. Then people would say, oh, I get it. So why do I think that I have the ideal IQ in terms of I have a high enough one, but of course somebody 20 points lower than I I feel sorry for because they're sitting down there at the bottom. Didn't work out that way. With the general population, it did work pretty well. Among academics, I got a whole lot of people who say, well, actually, I do feel kind of inferior.
Especially mathematicians.
Oh yeah.
Very true.
Yeah. Anyway, my point is this. One of the reasons that this kind of segregation that I talk about in Coming Apart, and we talked about to some degree in the bell curve, is bad for us, bad for people like us, is that we tend to be condescending to people who do not feel the slightest bit inferior to us, who recognize that we're smarter. So what? In terms of they don't want to trade their lives with ours, they don't want to do this, that, or the other thing. And for us to condescend to them is just plain wrong. And so when you're talking about diversity and so forth, I would like the left to supplement its intellectual concern for the disadvantaged with a more visceral understanding of the people they are calling disadvantaged do not warrant their pity. That's a fundamental misunderstanding of the relationship that they have with other human beings.
Ross.
A comment on Professor Rosen's, the objections you encountered, especially the one, you can't do this to people. Of course, this raises the issue, Charles Murray touched on it when he talked about paternalistic governments, that certain authoritarian governments do think you can do all sorts of things to people. And some years ago, the government of Shanghai burst out with discussion spilling over into publications, which of course means government publications, of how Shanghai's elitist position might be maintained by population policies and other policies. And they were influenced by Lee Kuan Yew's idea of how you would make Singapore smart, since it wasn't big and it didn't have a happy environment. And so they talked about policies that would discourage parents with, I'm not sure whether it was lower IQ, Charles, or lower education, from having more children. Now, as we know, there's a one-child policy in theory, but there's all sorts of incentives within Chinese population policy, monetary incentives and other to bring the outcome that you want. Now, of course, the government of, and this stopped actually, interestingly. It stopped rather suddenly, as things sometimes do in China. But whether this was because the underlying thought about it was against the lingering remnants of a socialist worldview in China, or whatever, I don't know. But clearly Shanghai was thinking of the migrant workers, the farmers coming into the cities and having more children than the brilliant Shanghai families did, and what kind of public policy might minimize that.
If I might just comment, we know that there are variations in the attitudes of governments towards the degree in which it's legitimate to engage in the modification of human beings to affect their performance. We see what some governments do with regard to Olympic athletes, for example. So I think one of the interesting phenomena that will come back, Professor Mansfield, with regard to IQ, is you may have very significant international variations with regard to the applications of the technologies which are emerging, which will be capable of modifying cognitive performance. One of my colleagues, yes, I'm specifically talking, is doing some work on the issue of cognitive arms races, in which, not because of technological inferiority, but because of different ethical and legal perspectives, we might find ourselves at various kinds of interesting deficits. And then the interesting question, does it matter? Or in what ways does it matter?
For people who aren't familiar with this, China is engaged in a very aggressive attempt to understand the genetics of IQ. And the reason they want to understand the genetics of IQ is that they want to get a lot more high IQ people. Seems to me they got enough already, but they want more. And they are proceeding, we know it's complex. The genetics of IQ is like, as you said, all of these things. Hell, even the genetics of height are very complex. The genetics of IQ are very complex, but it is going to be figured out sooner or later, and we are going to be able probably to jack up intelligence. And China is going to get there way ahead of everybody else if current trends continue, and that could have implications.
Tom
I just
Palmer.
want to ask you about the near immediate future of the space you occupy and sort of educating the public. Many of us see you as a really courageous collector of research, important research, and you present the truth to as you see it, and can withstand the criticism. Are there other people that you see coming up, following you, maybe even multiplying and doing this, that you follow and will continue this courageous effort?
First, thank you very much for saying that. The short answer is that there are a lot of people out there who I admire, who are willing to talk about complicated things. I'm thinking of Tyler Cowen, who recently had a book called Average is Over, where he talks quite blithely about a lot of these phenomena and how they're going to play out, but very honestly as well. There are... I don't sense that there is much change in academia. And you are probably in a better position to judge this than I am. I frankly am pretty appalled when I look at the extent to which race, class, and gender still seems to contaminate, distort, limit really important sociological and political and economic research. Am I right in that, or is it, from my perspective from outside, am I overstating the situation?
It's also it has entered administrative policies much more than when you wrote the book. Not just research, but diversity, vice presidents of all this kind of thing. Do we know, as you get applicants for assistant professorships, or as you go out and seek assistant professorships in the various departments represented here, do you find a sufficient number of heterodox applicants who are really interested in doing stuff that pushes the envelope of what's politically correct?
That's a leading question. Of course not. Come on.
No, it was a serious question. I mean,
No, it's not even close, but the self-selection happened many years earlier, that by the time you get to the pool of people that are applying to faculty, if you don't drink the Kool-Aid, you didn't even make it through grad school.
And I would say in journalism too. Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, it gets selected out of the undergrad level or earlier.
I think that's a really serious overstatement. I think in political science it's much more diversity.
And I think the problem is less political correctness, and the problem is hyper-professionalization, in which people understand what the incentives are with regard to the character of the work that they do, and they drink the Kool-Aid, which is they want to get the jobs, and so they do what they're expected to do.
well, I will add something that I've been told many times about my own career, which is that when I started writing Losing Ground, I was 38. It was published when I was 40. And I've had lots of people say, if you tried to take on a topic like that while you were an assistant professor, the peer pressure on you not to do that would have been enormous, just because you aren't supposed to take on big macro issues like that. You're supposed to do a series of very precise, focused technical articles.
Rewarded for giving A+ answers to C+ questions.
I got to remember that. That's very good. Yeah. And by the way, for those of you who might be in the job market, know people who are, think tanks are a very different world from that. And there is a lot to be said for going to work for a think tank. Because yes, there are some, unfortunately Heritage Foundation has become this way, where you do have to toe the line to the whatever the party line is for that think tank. But there are others like AEI and Brookings, and some others, I think Hoover would be another example, several, in which I think you have more real academic freedom than you have at Harvard. And by real academic freedom, I mean you can go ahead and write and you are not going to be shunned by your peers, and it certainly worked out that way for me. I've often thought, what if Dick Herrnstein had lived? That Harvard wasn't going to fire him. Would Harvard have stood behind Dick, though, in any other ways, as AEI stood behind me? And I suspect the answer is no. I would like to think that many of his colleagues, well, Harvey would have, obviously, James Q. Wilson would have, although Jim may not have been here by that time. But he would not have had, I don't think, a large array of colleagues saying this is a wonderful scholar and he's our friend, and quit saying nasty things about him. And so anyway, the younger members of the class sitting here, I want you to think about another alternative to the academic ladder when you get ready to go out there.
I don't want to toot my horn too loud, but a year and a half ago I published a retro review of Michael Young's The Rise of the Meritocracy and the American Interest. And what struck me about going back and reading that book again after 50 years, I didn't read it 50 years ago, it's very characteristic that as he evolved in his thinking, that toward the end of his life he was against his idea. The meritocracy had gone too far. And I think that one of the aspects of cognitive dissonance that operates here is something that Robert Nisbet understood fairly early on. He gave a talk at the Philadelphia Society. He wrote an essay called Uneasy Cousins, between conservatism and libertarianism, trying to contrast their different worldviews. And in that, he made the point that, apropos Young, that there's positive discrimination, not only negative discrimination, and that what we have seen is something, as a result of affirmative action, a reinstatement of certain aristocratic tendencies that Harvard had that gave up back in the 1950s. And to understand it in those terms is not to say that it's unworthy of criticism, but there seems to be a natural inclination to move in the direction of reestablishing. That's what Young was so upset about toward the end of his life, because it was establishing, you call it a cognitive elite, but it's a cognitive aristocracy too.
Well, first place, Dick and I were unhappy about this in 1994 in the bell curve. And what I've tried to do in Coming Apart a couple of years ago was in effect say the things Dick and I were worried about in 1994 have now happened. And one of the things I was saying last night, for those of you who aren't there, is that what I see increasingly among the cognitive elite is a feeling at ease with being an upper class, feeling at ease with thinking that you're better than other people. You don't want to put it in terms of better, but you say you're smarter, you're more able to solve certain kinds of problems, and therefore you're entitled to do these kinds of things, which is very un-American. But it's more than that. I have a phrase that I've used, which is that this new class, this new aristocracy that you're talking about, has gotten very good at living glossy lives and gotten very bad at living textured lives. That when you hang out, if you're in Washington, D.C., only with other people who live in Chevy Chase or Northwest Washington, or if you're at Harvard and you only hang out with Harvard faculty and similarly situated people who come to visit, you're missing out on a lot of really fun stuff. You're missing out on interesting things. You're missing out on all the texture that goes into a life lived in the midst of your fellow Americans. And this is the thing, I talk in Coming Apart about the new upper class and the new lower class, and a lot of people are focused on the problems that the new lower class has. I'm really much more worried about the problems of the new upper class.
Well, you're a man who both quantifies and qualifies IQ. And with that, we want to thank you for that.